Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. I think this is going to be a fast-paced 50 to 60 minutes this morning. My name is Eric Hazelbush. I'm a partner at Benchmark, and joining me today is Mike Newland. He's a senior consultant at Benchmark. We've got a lot of good information today. If we would look at this information and unpack it, it would probably fit into our two-day seminar that we do every year. So a lot of information. We'll probably cover some things quickly, and we may skip over some things. And so if there are questions after this session, feel free to reach out to us and we can have some one-on-one conversations. We've received a lot of questions already, which is good. Thank you for those. We will answer those either throughout the presentation or at the end. But if you have thoughts and have questions you'd like us to answer, please use the Q&A function of Zoom and submit those, and we will ask or answer as many questions as we can today. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started, and we will share a couple slides about Benchmark, but then we will get into the core of the content today. So a little bit about Benchmark. We've been in business since 1983. We're independent and a privately owned firm. We focus on three primary things: evaluation, design, bid, and construction phase services. Think about that as eyes in the field during construction. And that all kind of wraps up into kind of a program management philosophy. Mike and I are headquartered out of our Cedar Rapids office. We have an office in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and then we have 21 consultants located throughout the rest of the United States. And we have around 115 employees today, working with lots of different companies. So three things I'd like you to just remember about Benchmark. One is technical, what differentiates us from other companies and kind of what sets us apart, we believe. Number one is we're focused on technical excellence. And it's not just our consulting technical excellence, it's everybody from accounting through account management, drafting. Everybody in this company is focused on being the best they can be in terms of technically excellent. Number two is client focus. We spend a lot of time understanding client goals, so we can develop and create shared long-term value. And then the third piece is kind of unique, I think, but it's organizational health. It really focuses on having a healthy organization and having a team that's unified. When we work together, really good things happen going forward. And finally, the promise we make today and every day we talk with somebody is we'll always keep your best interest in mind. That's the only thing we can promise going forward. So one more quick note about Benchmark, and this is simply a picture, an aerial image of our office roof. And we kind of are roof junkies. And what you see here, for 15 years, we had coatings on our roof. We had various different coatings that allowed us to see how they performed, and we can learn from that. In 2021, we re-roofed our building and turned it into quite a difficult project. There are 14 different roof sections, 3 different membrane types: PVC, EPDM, and modified bitumen. It's just kind of an opportunity for us to see how systems perform and to learn right here in our backyard. So if you're ever in Cedar Rapids, Iowa or near here, love you to stop by. We'd be glad to show you our roof and talk about different systems.
And Eric, I might add that we'd love, as we go through this, you'd mentioned we're kind of junkies here at Benchmark for roof stuff. If there's questions you have that maybe you're not comfortable answering or asking today, or you've got some more specific, want a little more detail, give us a call. We'd be happy to help in any manner that we can. So,
yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. And one thing I think you'll see today is Mike and I aren't sitting in the same room, but we're treating this as if we are. And so we'll probably jump in and add comments from time to time when each of us are talking. So let's touch base on the webinar. We're going to focus on 3 things: identify some gaps in your roof evaluation, design, and quality assurance programs for food processing facilities, strategies to justify repair and replacement budgets, and reduce risk through implementation of a roof management program. We'll share a case study, and then we'll have some Q&A. And so before we step forward, we're going to have our first poll question. And that poll question is, have you experienced any unplanned and or costly plant production disruptions due to roof issues? So the poll question should have popped up on your screen. It's pretty simple. Please answer yes or no. We'll give you a little bit of time to do that. And then we will close that and just touch base on that a little bit. So as we look at the results, yes, almost 80% of you have had some sort of unplanned or costly plant production disruption. And that is a painful situation to be in, and not the one that's not uncommon. We see quite often. So hopefully we will provide some information today that can help you put some plans in place to reduce the risk of those things happening. And as we work in this industry and read headlines in the morning, imagine tomorrow morning if you woke up and had a headline, leaky roof blamed for tainted product. Contamination results in product recall. $160 million in lost sales and 30% reduction in stock price. Those are real headlines that have taken place in the industry. And so the impact of the roof that can have on these is tremendous, and we want to reduce that risk. So is protecting roof assets and reducing risk important? Kind of crazy even to put that statement up there, but of course it is. Absolutely, incredibly important to protect roof assets and reduce risk. So the question is, why is it that 80% of you, or almost 80% of you, have had roof problems that have shut down or caused delays or other issues at your facilities? What's causing those problems, and what can be done to reduce the risk of those problems? So the first thing we're going to take a look at is there's things taking place in the roofing industry that might have an impact on how you're managing your roofs and some of the outcomes. So let's take a look at what's taking place. The roofing industry is a fairly large industry, $150 billion industry. There's about 1 million workers and 55,000 contractors. I think the largest commercial roofing contractor today doesn't even make up 1% of the industry. So it's very fragmented. Some of the issues they're facing, supply chain, and this is an issue that you're all dealing with right now as well, but it impacts when we can get materials we can get, systems we can specify, impacts a lot of things in the roofing industry. But the real big issues, I think, are the next three. Number one is worker shortages. We're seeing it across not just the roofing industry, but in this case, the roofing industry is having a difficult time finding workers. It's not just finding workers that have skills to know how to install and want to work in that industry. And so that's a challenge today. It's been a challenge for a long time. But when you look at many roofing crews, you see a lot of folks that probably have been doing it for a long time, had a lot of experience and skills. Those people are starting to retire and go away, and there's a gap to fill. Litigation. When you look at new construction or even an existing facility, the total cost of the roof on those buildings is small compared to everything else in place. But roofs account for 50 to 65% of all construction-related litigation. Huge issue, a lot of risk associated with roofs, but it's a small cost in many cases of construction. And then lack of knowledge, skills, and training. And it's not just for crews, but it's for leaders as well, leaders in the industry. And if you looked at just a year ago, there are 85 schools that offer construction management in the United States. Only one at that time had roofing as part of their curriculum. Now today, I think that number has increased, and there's an organization called the Roofing Alliance, which includes the NRCA, manufacturers, contractors, consultants, and part of their focus is helping address the issue of knowledge, skills, and training in the industry. So really an important issue. But knowing these things can impact, it brings more risk when projects are being done at facilities, when you have shortage of labor and you have shortage of skills. So we shift from there and look at a study on roof failure. So let's talk briefly on a roof failure study. And this was a study completed by RCAWI, it's the Roofing Industry Committee on Weather Issues. And they looked at preventable and non-preventable failures when they studied these roof failures. And it's interesting when you break down the loss and the causes. And I'm going to start at the bottom of this chart where it looks at normal wind loss. There are some cases where no matter what you do, you have the right design, it's installed correctly, you've used the right materials, and you've done preventive maintenance. But because of weather events like we just experienced or are experiencing down in Florida, you have wind loss. And there's really not a lot you can probably do about that. But when we start looking at the rest of their findings and go to the top of this chart, design, they found design issues resulted in roof failures. That was a preventable issue. workmanship, how the roof was installed, a preventable issue, material, whether that's selection type, material failure, I'm not sure, but preventable. And then finally, maintenance related issues, a huge area that just gets overlooked. So it's amazing when you look at this, the majority of failures in this study could have been prevented had these areas been addressed initially during the process. So from that, we're going to go ahead and talk about food industry roofs. And as you think about roofs in general, they all face a lot of tough conditions. You know, we have wind, we have rain, hail, extreme temperatures. So it doesn't matter if you're a school or a food processing facility, all roofs have environmental conditions. But we do know the food processing industry and food industry in general has other issues you have to deal with. And I know Mike's going to make some comments. He'll jump in at some point here, but I know regulation issues create some challenges for food processing. The activities below a roof. I'm sitting in an office building today, and I can go from my office down to the end of the building, and the conditions under the roof are not going to change. But when we start looking at the food industry, we have freezers, we have coolers, we have production areas, we have processing areas, we have warehouses, office space, conditioned, unconditioned. And so all those different activities below the roof impact how that roof is designed and how that roof is maintained. So tremendous difference in how you look at food processing roofs versus many roofs out there.
You know, if I might, Eric, I think this it's really a couple of the key components here. The USDA and FDA 1997 laws really had some impact on the definition of freezers, coolers, production, and it's based on the size of the space as well as the temperatures and so on that those areas are maintained at. So it's kind of interesting as we look at it from a roofing perspective, what happens beneath that roof area, be it a freezer or a cooler in particular, those temperatures impact how we deal with the roofing systems and the design. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the presentation. But two of the main points that interestingly USDA and FDA talk about is air movement and controlling air movement. And it's critical when you've got freezers and coolers, and then you've got adjacent roof areas separated maybe by a firewall or even an exterior wall of controlling that air movement. And interesting, the regulations that are in place as it pertains to roofing from that standpoint and part of that design element. So we'll talk about more of that in a little bit here.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And then we look at, in some spaces in food, you're cleaning every day, every night, adding a lot of moisture into those spaces inside. And all of a sudden you've got all that humidity and moisture potentially driving up into the roof system. Contaminants are a big issue. And, we've listed a few here: oils, fats, cleaning agents, chemicals, could be blood, could be all kinds of things that can get the roof can be exposed to. And so understanding what those things are is really important as you design the roof system. And then the last piece is ponding water is just not a good thing to have on any roof, but more so on a food processing facility when there's bacteria and disease and things can be carried in that water. You get punctures from maintenance, whatever it would be, and all of a sudden that shows up inside the facility and causes lots and lots of problems. So let's go ahead and look at one more poll question, and then we will continue on. Poll question number 2 is, do you have a program to manage your roof assets? And I think it will be interesting when we start looking at and laying out what does a program actually entail. So in this case, a third, 33%, have a program, and 67 do not have a program. And those of you that have a program of some sort, that is fantastic. Really, really important. I think you'll see tremendous benefits from having a program. For those of you who don't, I think we'll share some things to consider and think about as you consider a program going forward. So we're going to talk about the first piece of a program. And just thinking about this pie chart, and what it would look like if your roofs are replaced every 20 years. Just using that as a simple way to look at this. If you get an average performance of 20 years out of your roof, you'd be replacing 5% of your roofs per year. And in many cases, we have clients that have a replacement program. And so they're focused on this small 5% piece of these roofs, and they have a 5-year plan to replace those roofs. But what can happen is the remaining 95% of these roofs, and it's where you have a replacement program or you have a roof management program. If we forget about the remaining 95% and don't look at repairs and maintenance or coatings or other options, we forget about the largest part of our asset. And it can create some real challenges that are very costly. And we'll see where your 5% replacement, if we don't address the other 95%, could become 6% replacement, 7%, or 10% replacement, because those other 95% are no longer lasting 20 years and they start pushing into that replacement area. So we'll take a look at that as we go forward. So as we think about a program, we think there are 9 areas that would make sense to evaluate and consider. And for us, it starts with goals. And do you have a goal for your roof management program? And what is that? Because when you establish the goal and understand what that is, it allows you to build the rest of the program to accomplish those goals. And we'll talk about some of those goals in just a second. Corporate guidelines. Do you have some corporate guidelines or standards that impact roof design, roof maintenance, or even quality assurance of roofs being installed? So understanding what your corporate guidelines are and developing those. Then we start getting into a roof inventory and condition assessment. As you look at your facility or you look at your portfolio of roofs, do you have an inventory of all your assets, and do you know the condition of those assets? Do you have that now? Number 4, a 5-year plan. We tend to think in 5-year plans. We've looked at some that are 10 years, but generally we have a pretty good idea of looking at the progression of roofs over 5 years. We start getting out to 10 years, it gets a little bit harder to look at performance because a lot of things can impact that. But do you have a 5-year plan that addresses repairs, maintenance, coatings, recovers, or replacements? Then number 5, and this is a big one in terms of prioritization. Where do you spend the first dollar? We know in many cases it is difficult to get funding for expense money or capital money for managing roofs. And so do you have a plan in place of how do you prioritize? So if you don't get your full allocation of what you need, where do you spend that first dollar? So it's important to have a process or a way to prioritize. And we'll talk about how you can look at both condition and risk in a little bit. And the next piece is ability to manage risk. We believe you can have a roof inventory and know the condition of your assets, but you also need to look at risk of what's taking place inside that facility. So if you have a production area where you have food processing taking place versus an office location or an empty warehouse, the risk associated with water coming into those areas is significantly different. And so having a process to evaluate those differences helps you with funding and prioritization. Maximizing procurement. We believe there are opportunities related to both timing and bundling of projects that you can maximize procurement dollars and take some opportunities for some advantages there. The last thing then is safety. Does safety play a role in your program? And we believe safety should play a role in that program. And we won't touch on that a lot today. We'll talk more about risk, but safety does play a role. You can take the first 8 of these, and when we get to number 9, the action plan, if there's not a plan of action, there's no reason to spend time in the first 8. And it is surprising at times. We see some companies executing a program like this very well. We see others that they may have semblance of a program, but the taking action part is really difficult. And so that's probably the biggest area I can stress, that you have to take action if you put a program in place. So let's take a look at some roof management goals. And as you see at the bottom right here, we look at planning, design, construct, and repair and maintain. Kind of 4 phases as you think about your assets. But we'll start with goals. And these goals are somewhat generic because they're not specific to a company today. But as you think about your operations and your business, what would these goals look like for you? And we look at these in 3 categories. Number 1 is protecting your investment. And that can be dramatically different depending on facility. It can be financial, or it can be a risk or health and safety. And so we like to understand, what does that mean to protect your investments? Number 2, how do you manage your expenditures? And we think that starts with, can you extend asset life? We think it's really important as you look at your assets to think about, how do we start with extending asset life versus just replacing? Can we extend the life of the existing assets? And then the second part is prioritizing and spending your money effectively. So we get down to the 3rd phase of increasing management efficiency. And it's really important. Is the information and data you have, is it good? Is it reliable? Is it consistent? Is it accurate? And is it information and data you can use to manage expenditures and protect your investment? So if you have good data about the condition of your facilities, it allows you to make much better decisions for managing expenditures and protecting your investment. So that's in big picture how we think about it. But it's really important in our mind to sit down with individuals and talk through, what do these goals look like for you? Because they can be different for each company. So as we jump into the planning phase, it starts with knowing the condition of your assets, so you can manage risk and cost, and you look at having an inventory, completing an inventory assessment. This allows you to prioritize budgets and ultimately take action. So let's dig into this a little deeper. We've talked a lot about data and information. And one of the things that it gets a lot of attention today, and we have a lot of clients talking about this, but it is the use of UAVs or drones. It's kind of a hot topic right now. And I want to talk just a little bit about this as it relates to collecting data and turning that into information that you can use. Benchmark's been involved with UAVs for probably 6 years. We outsourced for the first 4.5, 5 years. In the last year and a half ago, we purchased our own system, trained our own pilots. So we have roof consultants that are pilots flying these drones. And some things just want to make you aware of as you consider these. I've got to note the right data for both infrared moisture scans and for RGB, just think standard images. Do you have the right systems and processes where you can collect that data accurately? But more importantly, and what we've learned and seen, there are a lot of drone companies out there flying and collecting data. They don't have the ability to analyze and use that data and turn it into information. So I think you need to be careful because the infrared scan on the screen can be very difficult to read at sometimes. And so it's important you have people that understand and have the expertise to analyze the data so you can turn it into useful information, and then need to have a way to share that data and information. So that was just a little side on UAV, because it's a topic that a lot of people are seeing. We're seeing companies talk about, you don't even need to step on a roof anymore. You can collect it all from a UAV and a drone. The reality is you can collect some data, but you cannot evaluate the condition of a roof with a drone alone. There's some real gaps there and risk there. So with that, we start looking at, as I made a comment earlier about extending asset life. This graph, as you look at the first line where it says typical, it's on 17.5 years, and that is an NRCA study that showed a typical roof performs for 17.5 years. That means some roofs are performing for 8 years, and some roofs are performing for 40 years. But as we look at maximizing service life, it is looking at your portfolio and saying, where do you fall on this chart? And what has to happen so you can take your roofs from 17.5 years to 20 years, to 22 years, to 26 years? Because, and we can start looking at return on investment on these things, and how you get that done. But it's really important when you think about it's simply let's extend the life of that asset, and it's repair and maintenance that quite often will result in that. Mike, did you have a comment on that?
I do. It's interesting, Eric, that, the studies that the NRCA has done, and really the two factors that are probably the most critical are, first of all, initial design, making sure that you've got the design in place that incorporates the materials that are appropriate for those roof areas that are impacted on your facilities. And the second is that repair and maintenance piece. It's incredible the return on investment when you do a life cycle cost analysis of what the repairs and maintenance, how it can impact and extend the service life of existing roof systems. You had mentioned earlier, Eric, which is a very good point, that part of a program need be the consideration of, all right, how do I keep a roof from falling into that failure category? We don't want a roof replacement program. We want a roof management program. And the way to reach that service life potential, the greatest return on investment, again, this isn't just our data, this is NRCA data, that the maintenance and repair activities, and you're going to dive into that a little bit deeper here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the design aspect of it here shortly as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. But this just tells such a great picture of it is how do we extend asset life? And if we don't have a program in place, it's almost impossible to extend asset life. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. And what we're looking at here is just an example of what a 5-year budget might look like. And I'll break this down a little bit further. And it may be difficult for you to see all these areas on this slide, but I'll talk through them. And some of these I'll pop out so you can see them a little bit closer. But this is just a very simple version of a slide. Imagine if this had 150 roof sections on here versus probably the 10 that are on here. Or imagine if there were 30 locations bundled into a report like this as well, where you can prioritize against a full portfolio of assets. So what we're looking at, we have a condition rating, we have a risk rating. We'll talk more about that in a second. We designate the building, we designate the roof section, square footage, age or estimated age, and then we get into a 5-year cycle of repair and maintenance, replacement, or coatings. And so I'll go to the next slide. And this pops out. So as we talked about risk earlier, when we look at the condition of a facility, the ARCI is a condition rating index. And so the higher the number, the poorer the condition of that asset. And we look at a lot of different factors from the field, drainage, historical information, flashings, penetrations, adjacent conditions. There's lots of factors that go into that number. But then we step over to the RIRA, which is a risk factor. And it's simply red is worse, orange is a little bit better, green is good, as we look at the risk or sensitive to moisture inside that facility. So again, when you think production area versus office, higher risk of water entering a production area than there is an office area.
Eric, one of the interesting things with regard to food processing plants, I've got 3 clients that we're working with, and how they approach the roof condition index versus RIRA. The roof condition index, folks, keep in mind that really is the condition of the asset above the deck. Okay, what happens below the deck is that risk piece. And it's interesting to me that of the food processing clients that we're working with, how they even approach that risk factor a little bit differently. For example, a production line, if it's beneath the roof area, very obviously very high priority and very high risk if in fact you do have leaks that shut that line down. Whereas if you look at even a warehouse, a cold storage facility of the food processing, interestingly, still a very high risk, but not quite as high as that production. So you may find those falling into that orange or 12 range and so on. Why I think this is important, folks, is that you'll have an opportunity to really evaluate from the function beneath that roof area, it really holds a higher weight and priority based on that risk. Office areas, as Eric mentioned, not as high of priority. But again, for food processing, depending upon what that function is, that risk component really can be a telltale sign in helping in that, assisting in the priority.
And so as you look at the column with the yellow end, those are repair expenses. Those are repairs, and they're $60,000. So if your budget is $35,000 for repairs, RIRA helps you determine where you spend those first $35,000, because if a roof falls under risk of green, you're probably going to focus on red and orange areas first with the first dollars you can spend. And the same way with replacement. If you have multiple replacements that fall in the same year and you can't get the capital to replace them all, you'll probably treat some with emergency repairs, but those that are high risk, those would go to the top of the list as you look for funding for replacement. And it does help build the case for justifying funding as well when you can associate risk with that condition also.
Exactly.
And so the last slide really shows, in this case, there's about $5 million in replacement, $60,000 in repairs. If those repairs are not done, the $5 million in replacement may change to $7 million or $10 million 2 and 3 years down the line. And so it does help you build the case for why it's important to get those expense funds, but sometimes that can be difficult depending on how your funding structures are set up. If corporate makes all the decisions on capital and expense, a little bit easier, but sometimes you may have corporate handles capital, the facility handles expense. And but at least having some insight and visibility into what's going to happen if we don't spend this money on repair and maintenance, it will impact our capital budget down the line. So let's go to the next slide. And this is simply a roof drawing, and the roof drawing contains lots of information. We won't get into it all today, but as you look at everything is color coded. It shows areas of bad roof deck where deck needs replaced. It shows areas of wet insulation that we identified from an infrared moisture scan. It shows areas that are deficiencies are located, and it shows photo locations showing those deficiencies. In addition, at the bottom of this, it shows a drawing colored orange, green, red, and blue, and that's indicated based on roof life of those areas. So it's a very simple way to help somebody understand, here are the issues that are taking place at this facility and how it impacts a future replacement schedule. Then the last piece, and this is only, I'm just going to show one chart. There's many other things you can look at, but I think this is interesting. As we go back to, if your roofs are lasting 20 years, you're replacing 5% of those roofs a year. And so over a 1 to 5 years, you'd potentially replace 25% of your roofs. And this is a next estimated replacement based on condition. So as you look at the blue piece of the pie chart, 1 to 5 years, 22% of your roofs identified for replacement. That's fitting into a 20-year cycle. And that seems reasonable. Now, when you look at the red area, roofs identified for replacement in 6 to 10 years, 72% of your roofs need replaced or identified for replacement in 6 to 10 years. And the concern becomes that is a tidal wave of capital expenditures that most companies just aren't prepared for. And, it is an opportunity when you have this information to be able to make some business decisions on what do we do. And the goal might be, we want to take those roofs that are 6 to 10 years, we want to shrink that from 72% down to 40%. Can we do that with aggressive repairs and maintenance? Can we do that through coatings? Can we do that through recovers? What options do we have to shrink that 6 to 10 year replacement down? And it might be, can we shift funding from replacement? Maybe we don't do replacements next 2 years and shift all those funds to repair and maintenance or coatings. But not having this information, you may never know you've got a tidal wave of capital expenditures coming. And in the world of food, having that many roofs that need replaced, And when replacement consists of shutting down lines in many cases, stopping production, having that many roofs coming at you over that time frame could be catastrophic to a facility being able to operate and perform primary functions. So really important to have information like this so you can make those decisions. Mike, anything else you see on this one?
You know, it's I think a very good point from a budgeting standpoint. We work with a current food processing client that literally takes $1 million a year out of their replacement budget, planned capital budget for roofing, takes $1 million right off the top and devotes it to that 6 to 10 year group of roof assets to be able to extend service life, to make sure that they don't fall into that early replacement. So again, it's how you prioritize the available funding. We recognize that you're not going to get all the money that you need. But what you need to be considering is allocating a portion of whatever roofing budget you have to the repair and maintenance piece. It is by far and away the best return on an investment that you'll make.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Hey, Mike, I'm going to jump back just for a second. We had a couple questions I didn't see come in.
Sure.
And, one of them relates to ARCI and RIRA. Please clarify, ARCI is above and RIRA is below. I'll go ahead and take that, Mike. But so the ARCI is a condition rating, and that rating is based on, in this case, it'd be a benchmark consultant walking on top of the roofs and evaluating the various components of those roofs, as I discussed, you know, penetrations, perimeter walls, edge metal, drainage, historical information. We look at all those factors, and that then combines into a condition rating that you saw earlier. And so that takes place on top of the roof. In RIRA, the risk rating, which is primarily driven by interior sensitivity to moisture, that actually takes place in a discussion with you, because you know the inside of your facilities better than we would or any consultant would. And so we would talk to you about, let's rank and rate interior sensitivity to moisture across all areas within inside your facility. So hopefully that answers the question as it relates to that. A couple other I'm just going to jump into. Why would schools not teach roofing? You know, that's a great question, and I don't think Mike or I have the answer to that, but I think we're thankful that organizations like the Roofing Alliance have identified that and saw some gaps. I mean, roofing is not something people wake up or graduate from school and say, I want to become a roofer, I want to be involved in the industry. So I think it just has gotten left behind. It's just not a sexy industry necessarily. It's a very relevant, very important. But other than that, I don't know why. I'm just thankful that we've got an organization that is looking at helping improve and make roofing a higher importance or relevant topic in the future.
You know, and it's interesting, Eric, that of the engineers that we have on staff and the 2 construction managers that graduated the construction management degree, never got an ounce of roofing. Again, thankfully, that is starting to change, but you know, the roofing not rocket science scenario is definitely not the case, and it really is more involved, and you know, hopefully we're impacting that educational piece through these societies and groups that are working toward that. Yeah. You know, this last one, Eric, if you don't mind, if I can take this question, was specific chemicals that when stored or used in manufacturing impact the life of a roof. And that a very good question. You know, not only is it the storage of the chemicals, for example, if you're storing them on a roof or whatever, that's obviously a no-no. But really what we're looking at is the discharge, the types of chemicals that are used in the food processing and manufacturing differ from food to food, right? So some manufacturing of cheese, you've got animal fats and so on. Manufacturing ketchups, you've got acids, and it can really vary depending upon what your plants are producing. So it's critical, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but the type of roof membrane and system that you specify based on what those emissions are. And that's really what we're going to look at, because you choose the wrong system based on the emissions that your plants are producing, you're going to reduce the service life of that roof significantly.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
So we're going to shift from the kind of the planning phase into, I guess I'll give a quick recap on planning, sorry. But, we see some of the pitfalls are reacting to leaks and failure versus being proactive, having incomplete or inaccurate information to base decisions on, and planning but don't take action. I'm not going to get through the rest of those. We're going to jump on to the next phase, and this gets into the design phase. And Mike, why don't you go ahead and talk through some of this?
You bet. So what we're really looking at the second piece of the pie here in the design, talking about specific design criteria. And listen, folks, we could literally have a 2-day seminar on this. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, trying to touch on some high points that we're looking at. Evaluating the options that we've got available, looking at approved contractors, materials. We get into the bid aspects of design where you've got detailed plans and specs. Accurate bidding will reduce your cost, the time frame, and then budgeting, bundling regional projects. Eric talked about that earlier, about the opportunities to economize. So we want to look at some building codes. Part of the aspect of design really is talking about some of the criteria, building codes. First and foremost, I'm going to highlight a few of these. Occupancy considerations, environmental consideration, the sustainability aspect of it. Are you putting solar on your roof? Looking at substrates. One of the, I think, most impactful design criteria is the insurance considerations. Many of our clients and many of you possibly are FM Global or Global Risk Consultants insured. FM Global is kind of the gold standard, or the standard that the industry follows, and very specific criteria with regard to your roof design based on those insurance requirements. The roof use, trafficability, slope, all of that, and then constructability considerations. One of the things about food manufacturing plants that we've learned is that these are dynamic environments. You're very often changing what happens beneath these roof areas and then installing new equipment and so on the top side, on the roof area. So we've got to consider these as constructability. Looking at the code requirements for loss prevention data, and specifically hail, has really changed since 2009, for example, the left chart on where severe hail lies versus in 2018, the band or the area of the United States that is now considered very severe hail rating. That impacts your design in that we've got to have beefier systems. You've got to have more components that meet that severe hail rating. So the building codes vary by region. Looking at the codes then for freezer and high humidity occupancies, refrigerated buildings tend to have a strong outside to inside vapor drive, requiring an intense concentration of perimeter vapor seals. But then you've also got, on the refrigerated buildings, we've got considerations of adjacent functions and adjacent occupancies that may have air movement between walls. I'd mentioned this earlier, between firewalls within the interior of your food processing plants. So we need to take into consideration that air movement. High humidity buildings have the opposite, where you've got inside to out. So as you're doing, interestingly, with food processing, you're cleaning your equipment, monthly maintenance, or whatever that schedule is, you're using hot water. And that creates humidity. So that vapor drive is going this way. So we're within the design, what the key is to stop that vapor flow from entering the roof system. We've got to figure out where that dew point is within the system. And that, again, is based on environmental conditions, where your plants are located. All of that need be factored in. So you look at the result of air movement and vapor drive, and what this slide is showing, folks, is two conditions. One is an exterior wall, and one is an interior wall, and where we've got ice forming. So the condition that caused this was not having a proper seal of the vapor barrier on the top side where you see the ice forming on the underside of the deck. Whereas as you see the ice forming on the interior, the underside of the deck along that adjacent wall, that was due to air movement from an adjacent area that was kept at ambient temperature. That warm air was not controlled and migrated into the cold, cooler space, forming this ice condition.
And this is not unusual to see this at many plants, because quite often the vapor retarder or vapor barrier just gets, it's not considered, because it's not considered, we're just roofing, doing a roofing project versus thinking about the conditions inside and how that will impact the design.
You know, one of the bigger considerations too, Eric, is very often, as I've mentioned, with food processing manufacturers that we work with, is the dynamic environment that changes, that production may change, it may expand, and you go into an adjacent space and you think that the roof above it is capable of, that has a vapor seal. More often than not, it doesn't. But you've also got to consider that wall exposure and that air movement. Sustainability then, that's a hot topic in our industry currently. Sustainable design begins with designing the roof to last as long as possible, right out of the get-go. Instead of using lower quality materials and so on, think of sustainability for the long term. If we can keep stuff out of the landfills, that's what our ultimate goal is. Reuse, repurpose, and recycling opportunities are really coming to the forefront with many companies that we're working with. Currently, one of our food manufacturing clients is utilizing their post-packaging waste to go into a roof cover board, a hard board utilized for hail resistivity, for example. We're talking about water management on the roofs. Very often codes require that your roofs can only discharge a certain amount of water into the stormwater management systems in the municipalities. So we're addressing that during that design phase. And then the lowest impact of chemical choice, the chemicals of concern, back to that question of, all right, what is my plant emitting? What is the food process manufacturing process emitting onto our roofing systems?
Yeah, Mike, one point, we did have a question come in about, recycling and what's new taking place in recycling. And I think it's becoming a challenging time for recycling. There are some opportunities, new opportunities. I don't know, in some cases they're regional. We do have some clients that have zero landfill projects. And for some of their materials, they have found incinerators where they can incinerate materials that cannot be recycled. But we have seen where recycling of polyiso insulation, as long as it's clean and dry, can be done. And some of the materials and ballast on roofs can be recycled. Sarnafil has a nice program. Sika Sarnafil has a nice program for recycling PVC. So there are options out there for recycling. Sometimes it's impacted based on regions you're located in. There's been some issues with some of the recycling and where it goes. China was heavily involved in purchasing those materials, and we understand there's some changes in that. So really, when you want to look at recycling, it goes back to Mike's first point of sustainability begins with roofs that perform long-term, where you can coat them, recover them, and do everything you can so you don't have to tear them off and work on recycling. But recycling really comes down to the specific project, the system that's in place that needs to be torn off, and then looking for regional options to address that.
And then quickly, Eric, the last couple of slides here in design, if we, ponding water, we talked about in sustainability and water management, roofs may be designed to hold water. That's all well and good, but we've also got to consider then that drainage and ponding. Obviously, ponding water has contaminants, and we've got to avoid that. So then finally, there's gaps and common pitfalls. I'm not going to go through all of these, but first and foremost, the improper use of vapor barriers, particularly with freezers and coolers. We see this all too often. So be cognizant of that. And then questions considered is that, do you have detailed plans and specs that are accurate, that allow for apples to apples bidding, that can provide a good constructible roof for that roofing contractor. Risk management is the end of the design. We can mitigate risk in our design. So, and again, the opportunities to bundle, those are some opportunities that are often overlooked.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Let's go ahead and jump into the construction phase. And we think there's a tremendous opportunity. When you look at the quote here, you get what you inspect. We believe it's important to ensure if you have a sound specification, you inspect to make sure it's installed as specified. And we think that starts with conduct a pre-construction meeting with all the parties involved, so everybody understands what needs to be done, and then have some sort of on-site quality assurance, and then a project closeout. But we think about owner's eyes in the field. If an owner has people that have the experience and knowledge to provide that service, that's great. It is difficult though. And we think there should be daily reports that show areas worked on, conversations taking place, issues and challenges that have come up. So those can all be tracked, and you can identify those in the future if there are issues. And then finally, if you have good workmanship, that equals good installation. You can see the top picture. It's a beautiful looking roof that's been laid down, and the one on the right it as well. If you have good workmanship, if you can verify it's installed as specified, that's going to result in a good installation and long-term performance. And this is just one example of hundreds that we have. But what you're looking at is a perimeter edge of a roof, and they likely had to raise the height of this roof. And so they added a wood nailer to the perimeter. As you look at that wood nailer, the bottom side of that, there's a rotted wood nailer that is horrible and should have been removed and replaced with new clean lumber. It was not. They just fastened in a new wood nailer over top of it. And once that roof is put down, you'll never see it until you have a wind event and that perimeter lets loose, because it's not really attached to anything. And these are the things that we see on roofs over and over during installations that we need to look out for and make sure you understand what the specification is actually calling for. So construction observation, this is a quote from the manual of build-up roofing systems. Rigorous inspection is the strongest line of defense against poor quality work. It's important to inspect the work being done. So let's go ahead and jump into some of the gaps. We see incorrect or improper materials delivered to project sites. You need to be able to verify what's coming on site. And we see roof systems installed incorrectly. And finally, unsafe work practices. So need to keep that in mind as you're looking at a program. The last piece we're looking at, repair and maintenance. And I would jump to the main point on this. If someone that does not own repair and maintenance at your company, it likely won't happen. And you have to have regular inspections of work being done and your roof systems. It does provide the highest return on investment of just about anything you can do to extend the life of your roofs. And this is just a simple roof we're looking at. You can see some repairs were made in the bottom hand. Some lab testing was done with this roof, and there were some issues with brittleness. They could keep trying to repair this roof over and over. It will never work because that roof is going to continue to tear apart. May have been the wrong system designed here. So that's the impact of improper design can impact how your ability to repair in the future as well. The last piece on repair and maintenance just don't get completed. It's amazing the number of times that they just don't get completed. And then when repairs do get completed, make sure you're doing the appropriate repair for the remaining service life of that roof. If that roof's going to last another 15 years, you better do a 15-year repair. Don't do a 2-year repair on a 15-year roof. And then make sure you're using the right repair materials, because if you use incorrect materials, it can damage and create further problems. So with that, we're going to jump into a case study on a failed vapor retarder, and I'll let you talk a little bit more about that, Mike.
Yep, thanks. So what we're seeing here again is the ice forming on the underside of the deck due to a compromised or lack of a vapor retarder. And this is the underside and what we first noticed and led us to this condition. But then we went to the top side during our evaluation process. Next slide is the infrared scan that was performed on this area, where you can see then that based on that failed vapor retarder, that vapor drive caused the insulation components of the roof system to become wet, saturated. So it's critical from the standpoint of the design when you're doing replacements or when new construction, that you've got that vapor retarder installed or specified in the correct area. The misuse of a vapor retarder will cause you more problems than not having one. So there are specific details. And again, I'm not going to get into a great deal of information here, but specific details for the type of roof system that you're installing, the deck, what's happening beneath it, a specific vapor retarder detail, so that we can control where that dew point is. Remember, that's what we're trying to achieve. Controlling that dew point, having it fall in the proper point within your roofing system.
And the next slide, Mike, actually answers one of the questions that came in as we look at how do you flash refrigeration or ammonia lines.
Yep, perfect. And it's interesting, folks. We've really refined this detail over the last several years based on the type of refrigerants, the type of pipes that are being utilized for ammonia glycol and so on, the insulated piping. The key component of this is that transition below deck, in between the two layers of insulation, having that spray foam, solid foam insulation on either side of that penetration to control that air movement. Very critical piece that has often been overlooked. So specific details for these penetrations is critical.
And those details come from actually taking core samples and cutting into the roof during the field work, so we understand what is there, how it's built, and so we can design a detail specific for that penetration.
Absolutely.
There have been roofs we have gone on that are saturated and they've got vapor barriers in place. They didn't do the details correctly at the penetrations, and that allowed moisture into the roof system. Something what you think is fairly simple isn't done correctly, and you've all of a sudden you put your roof into a replacement mode.
Yeah, particularly with these refrigeration lines, folks, you got to remember that these things are chilled, and even if that exterior wrapping or insulation of these pipes, if it becomes compromised, then you've got a vapor drive issue. So it's critical that these components are inspected periodically to make sure that the entire assembly is functioning as it should.
Thanks, Mike. I'll give a quick summary. I'm not going to really summarize. I'm going to jump into some questions since we just have a couple minutes left, Mike. And I think I'm going to combine these two questions. One was related to what membrane do you recommend on food processing facilities, and what membranes are best suited for emissions? If you can answer that real briefly, Mike.
You bet. So again, guys, one system does not fit all. We've got to understand what emissions are happening on your plants. We typically involve the membrane manufacturers. They would come out, do sampling, and determine what those chemicals are and what then the best material would be appropriate for those roof areas. So
Thanks,
there's
Mike.
not a one size fit all, bottom line.
Yeah, I'll jump through a couple more of these. What are we seeing for prices for roof systems today? We are seeing tremendous price increases over the last 2 years. We just looked at a project the other day. It was 140% increase in price over 2 years. And a roof that we had seen at $20 to $25 a square foot may be coming at $60 a square foot today. And we don't know what that's going to look like in the future. And if we had a crystal ball, we'd probably be in looking at other options if we knew what that was going to do. But we get asked this question a lot: what are pricing of materials going to do? It does impact the bid process, and so we are bringing contractors in sooner in some cases to help with budgeting and estimating. Go ahead, Mike.
There was a question, Eric, on does Benchmark confirm ammonia lines have the proper insulation thickness per IAAR prior to re-roofing the area? It's not a specific criteria that we look at. However, we do have, we're familiar with that criteria. So what our role in that process is to bring it to the attention, of the plant, of our engineering contact, so that can be properly addressed. The time to address it is during that re-roof. And then incorporate that information into our details specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Glad you grabbed that question. I think we're going to we'll answer one more question, then we'll follow up with those that we did not get answered today. It really had to do with how often should a roof be inspected, and it depends. It depends on the activity on your roof. It depends on the type of roof. It depends on the age of the roof. But I will say your roof should be inspected after any major weather event, or ideally between spring and fall. That doesn't mean it has to be someone like Benchmark doing inspection. It can be an overview by someone on your staff that looks for cleans drains, cleans debris out of gutters, looks for debris and items that can blow across your roof and get those things removed. And then as it relates to what we'd call a full evaluation, generally we're looking between 1 and 5 years. Again, it depends on what's taking place in your roof. It really depends, and it's depend on the roof system. So it is noon, at least Central Time. So we won't get to the rest of the questions, but thank you for your time today. We appreciate you spending it with us. And if you have additional questions you'd like to ask us, you can reach out to either Mike or myself on this next slide. Our information is here, or reach out to anyone at Benchmark. We'd be glad to talk to you. So thank you for your time and attention today, and have a great day.
Thanks all.